Greetings, health practitioners and all those interested in health. My name is Chris and I've retired from a 40-year career as a specialist, a medical specialist. I always give advice at the beginning of these podcasts that if people have any medical concerns, they should take them up with their favourite health practitioner. To date in these podcasts we've concentrated on the work of Professors Buckmaster and Harris, who wrote a book called Hippocrasy. And this book points out how much the medical profession is not practicing medicine in accord with the Hippocratic Oath, as their professional bodies and as the government requires them to do. In the first chapter of this book, the authors describe something that they label the opioid epidemic. This is something that developed in the early 90s, and it arose out of strange circumstances to do with the way medical practitioners examined patients. When they collected vital signs, they began to add parameters of pain, asking how much pain individuals were suffering. And it's nobody's surprise that people reported all sorts of pain, some of it quite severe, because pain, as we know, was ubiquitous from all sorts of things, toothache and arthritis. But to these doctors it appeared that there was an epidemic of pain developing, so much so that they felt that more and more patients should be prescribed stronger and stronger painkillers. And so, in the 90s and after the year 2000, till to date, more and more of these heavy painkillers were prescribed, and some of them were opiates, whose names are well known to you, things like Oxycontin and fentanyl. These were also being prescribed for chronic pain, or pain that lasted for more than 2 months. More and more patients were becoming addicted to these drugs, and more patients were dying as a result of accidental or deliberate overdose. And so it reached the stage where the government felt that they had to intervene. When governments intervene in a health crisis, this usually converts it into a catastrophe. So what the government began to do is, instead of prosecuting the companies that made the drugs, and in fact they were sued for billions and billions of dollars eventually, and none of their executives suffered any legal penalties, the governments began to chase doctors who prescribed these drugs, even though they were prescribing these drugs, they felt, for the benefit of their patients. The penalties that were imposed were excessive, and doctors were losing their licenses for significant periods of time. But it was totally unnecessary for the government to do this. All they had to do was to restrict the prescribing practices for these drugs in this group of doctors for a certain group of patients. But instead they took the heavy-handed approach. The result of this was that the medical profession became terrified of prescribing these drugs at all. So you had two sections of the medical profession, one section that were prescribing them too often, and the other section, the majority of doctors, who wouldn't prescribe them under any circumstances. So there were patients coming to medical practices, sometimes with severe acute pain or injury, and doctors were simply refusing to prescribe any of these heavy painkillers because they were afraid of government penalties. This caused a lot of suffering in the community, and eventually the government began to ban any drugs that contained even small quantities of opiates. This led to another problem because patients began to access more and more illegal drugs, and we know this because samples of wastewater from cities in this country and in other countries show an increasingly high level of illegal substances such as speed. In reality, the principle for prescribing these drugs should be that they should be prescribed for a very limited period of time. 1 month, 2 at the most. If this is done, the chance of people becoming addicted are negated, because you can't become addicted to something if no one's going to prescribe it to you. Also, these drugs should not be used for chronic pain or pain that lasts for longer than 2 months. If these principles are followed, then there's no problem. But now we have a situation where older people who sometimes have very severe pain go to the doctor, and they only need painkillers for a relatively short period of time, but doctors refuse to prescribe it to them, and these patients are treated like drug addicts. This problem is exacerbated by the fact that there are fewer and fewer doctors practicing in rural areas and more doctors practicing in the city. This maldistribution of medical practitioners is a great exacerbation of the problem. If you have severe acute pain and you have a good relationship with a doctor, he should prescribe these drugs, certainly without making you feel like a drug addict, in the short term to deal with the problem, and in the longer term use much milder painkillers, exercise regimes and health professionals to get you over the problem. If you insist in borrowing from a relative or using illegal drugs to deal with your pain, you're going to end up in a very dark place.